Chapter 13 is fiscal policy. Remember who conducts the fiscal policies? The answer is the government, the president, and the Congress. Why? Because they are the ones who are in control of fiscal policy tools. What are the fiscal policy tools? Government spending and taxes. Because government spending is the government's expenditure, and taxes are government's revenue. So the federal budget is the annual statement of the government's spending and revenue. Say, for example, in the United States in 2015, the federal government's tax revenue is $35.14 billion. And then they spend $41.58 billion. So they spend more than they receive. Therefore, in 2015, the government has a budget deficit. Just like you spend more than you earn, then you are going to have a deficit. And because the government spending and taxes are the decision of the governments, therefore, governments are in control of the government spending and taxes. The fiscal policy tools, two fiscal policy tools that the government use to conduct policy. Therefore, fiscal policy is conducted by the government, and the fiscal policy tools are government spending and taxes. If the government spend more than they collect, that is, government spending is bigger than the tax revenue, then the government will have a budget deficit. If the government receives more tax revenues than they spend, then they will have a budget surplus. Just like when you earn more than you spend, you're going to have surplus, the money that you can save. If the government collect taxes and spend them all, then we say the government is running a balanced budget. Okay? So a budget surplus, deficit, and a balanced budget is a flow variable. What does that mean? That means in every year, say for example 2013, 2014, 2015, government spending, taxes, and deficit. If in 2013 the government spending is 100, that is, they spend $100, say for example, and then they collect only $90 of tax, then their revenue is less than their spending. Therefore, they are going to have a $10 of deficit. Now, in 2014, say for example, they spend $100 again, and they only collect $80 of tax revenue. Then their deficit is 100 minus 80, which is 20. This 20, this 80, this 100 have nothing to do with anything in 2013. So these three variables are flow variables because they are determined independently in this year. Then government debt is a stock variable. What does that mean? Now let's add one more column. Say debt. Say for example, the debt at the end of 2013 is 0. Now, in 2014, because the government run a government deficit, therefore, the government will owe people $20. Therefore, the government's debt is 20. Now, in 2015, say for example, the government spending is still 100, and they only collect $90 of tax. What is their deficit? The answer is 10, because 100 minus 90 is 10. Then what is the government's debt? Well, before 2015, you owe people $20. You are in debt of $20. Now, you are running a deficit. You spend $10 more again this year. So your debt will be $30. That is 10 plus this 20. So this number 30 depends on this year's deficit, which is a flow variable, and also depends on the debt last year. So this number is called a stock variable because it is accumulative. It is accumulating. Say for example, in 2016, if you spend $100, you collect $110. Therefore, you have a surplus of 10. That is, you have a negative deficit of 10. Then you have this surplus. You can use this 10 to pay some of your debt. Therefore, your debt decreases by 10. Your debt becomes 20. Therefore, the government debt is a stock variable. Recall in chapter 10 actually. In chapter 10, we have learned that when the government increase government spending or cut taxes, then aggregate demand increases, aggregate demand curve shift to the right? And then we call that expansionary fiscal policy. On the other hand, if the government decreases government spending or increases tax, then aggregate demand decreases, aggregate demand curve shift to the left. We call that contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, this type of fiscal policy that is determined by the government's action is called discretionary fiscal policy. That is, the government does have a meeting and make a decision to increase government spending or increase taxes. These are called discretionary fiscal policies. Then what are non-discretionary fiscal policies? This is called automatic fiscal policy. That is, the policy action is automatic. The government does not have to make the decision. The policy effect is automatic. Say, for example, in a recession, the economy is bad, right? So the economy, the total income decreases. Many people lose their jobs. They don't have income. Therefore, fewer people pay income tax, or people pay less income tax. Therefore, taxes fall. Remember, when tax decreases, that's equivalent to a tax cut. So that's a contraction of expansionary fiscal policy. In addition, if the economy is bad, many people receive food stamps. So government's transfer payment increases. That is part of the government spending. So government spending will increase. So it looks like a expansionary fiscal policy. So both tax fall and increase in transfer payments look like an expansionary fiscal policy, and which happens in a recession and is automatic. The government does not have to have a meeting. Tax revenue falls and transfer payments, government spending increases. Therefore, when the economy is bad, automatic fiscal policy has an expansionary effect on the economy. So we call that automatic fiscal policy. On the other hand, if the economy is good, so in the economy, income increases. When income increases, the government can collect more taxes. So tax increases in an expansion, it looks like a contractionary fiscal policy. On the other hand, more people have jobs, so fewer people collect food stamps. Then government's transfer payment decreases. That is, part of the government expenditure decreases. And it looks like a contractionary fiscal policy. Therefore, when the economy is doing well in an expansion, the economy contracts by itself. The fiscal policy tools act like a fiscal policy tool that is automatic. Therefore, we call that automatic fiscal policy. Recall in chapter 11, we learned the expenditure multiplier. Remember what is an expenditure multiplier? That is, when autonomous expenditure increases by this amount, the results, equilibrium, expenditure, income, increases by a bigger amount. That is called expenditure multiplier. Remember that? Now remember, in chapter 11, we assume that government expenditure is autonomous. Remember, we assume government expenditure, investment, and exports are all autonomous. Therefore, government expenditure is autonomous. So government expenditure multiplier is exactly the expenditure multiplier. Right? Let me say it again. Recall in chapter 11, income is equal to expenditure, aggregate expenditure, which is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And consumption has autonomous consumption and induced consumption, right? And investment is autonomous, government expenditure is autonomous, export is autonomous. And when we were talking about expenditure multiplier, we say when autonomous expenditure increases because of the multiplier effect, go back to consumption, going back to consumption, income increases by this much, and then this much, and then this much, and then this much. The sum of them will be bigger than the initial increase in autonomous expenditure. Right? That is called expenditure multiplier. Now, we want to talk about government purchase multiplier. But government purchase is exactly right here. It is part of the autonomous expenditure. Therefore, what we have learned in Chapter 11 can be applied to government purchase multiplier directly. So what did we learn in Chapter 11? That is multiplier, expenditure multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the slope of aggregate expenditure function. And government expenditure is part of the total expenditure. Therefore, government expenditure multiplier is exactly the same thing. 1 over 1 minus the slope of aggregate expenditure function. And recall, we say assume that there's no import and there's no proportional tax. The slope of aggregate expenditure function, remember, the slope of aggregate expenditure function is from the slope of the consumption function and the slope of imports function, right? The slope of consumption function minus the slope of imports function. Now, if we assume that there's no import, then the slope of aggregate expenditure function is exactly the slope of the consumption function. What do we call the slope of the consumption function? Marginal propensity to consume, right? Therefore, if there's no import and no proportional tax, the expenditure multiplier or the government purchase multiplier is exactly 1 over 1 minus the slope of consumption, which is marginal propensity to consume. By assuming these two, we can have a simplified version of the multiplier. So that is the government purchase multiplier. Now let's introduce another multiplier in the fiscal policy. That is the tax multiplier. So what is the tax multiplier? When we increase the lump sum tax by a certain amount, what happened to the income? Remember, when tax increases, it's a contractionary fiscal policy. So income decreases. Therefore, the tax multiplier must be negative. It has a negative effect on the equilibrium income, equilibrium expenditure. Alright? Again, to make our life easier, make it easier to understand, let's make two assumptions. There's no import and there's no proportional tax. Then the lump sum tax multiplier is, which is negative. is negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. Why is that? Let me try to explain it in a shorter version. Remember, Y is equal to aggregate expenditure, income equal to expenditure, equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Where's the effect of tax? Do you see any T here? No, but remember, what is consumption function? It is autonomous consumption plus marginal propensity to consume multiplied by disposable income, right? What is disposable income? Disposable income is income minus tax. This is where tax comes into play. And look at this. What is the coefficient before G, which is 1? What is the coefficient before T? The answer is negative MPC. So if government expenditure multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC, now the tax multiplier must be 1 over 1 minus MPC, but multiplied by this negative MPC. Right? That is why the lump sum tax multiplier is negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. In detail, if you go through the multiplier effect process, you can prove that my claim here is correct. This is the tax multiplier. The third multiplier that we want to introduce in fiscal policy is called the balanced budget multiplier. What is the balanced budget multiplier? Remember, what is the balanced budget? Remember, what is a balanced budget? A balanced budget is when the government increases tax, say by $1, that is, they collect $1 more revenue, and then they spend it all. Then the government is running a balanced budget. Therefore, what is a balanced budget multiplier? The answer is, if the government increases taxes and government spending by exactly the same amount, say $1, then what happened to equilibrium expenditure? Income. Is the answer 0? That is, when the government collect more taxes from the citizens and then spend them all on the citizens. Does that mean it has no effect on the aggregate economy? The answer is no. Why? Remember, when the government tax increases by 1, what happened to the equilibrium expenditure, equilibrium income? The answer is lump sum tax multiplier, that is negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. Then what happened to the aggregate economy when the government increases government spending by $1? The answer is the equilibrium expenditure, equilibrium income increases by 1 over 1 minus MPC if there's no tax and there's no proportional tax and there's no imports. So what is the effect of both an increase in tax and an increase in government spending by exactly the same amount? Say $1. The answer is, this is 1 minus MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. The answer is 1. That is, when government simultaneously increases tax by $1 and increases government spending by $1, the result is the equilibrium income expenditure will increase by $1. Therefore, if there's no imports, no proportional tax, the balanced budget multiplier is equal to 1. So when government increases lump sum tax by, say, $5 and then spend them all, the result is equilibrium expenditure, equilibrium income increases by the same amount. Now, let's look at some example that apply these multipliers. Now, this question says the economy is initially at point A. So we are here. Initially, we are here. Suppose that the slope of the aggregate expenditure function is 0.5. The slope of aggregate expenditure is equal to 0.5. There's no import, no proportional tax. Now we want to shift AD0 to AD1. Where's AD0? AD0 is right here. AD1 is right here. So we want to shift AD0 to AD1. This is the aggregate demand curve. So if we want to shift aggregate demand curve from this one to this one, how much should we shift the aggregate demand curve? The answer is we shift every point on the aggregate demand curve to the right. By how much? By this much, by this much, by this much, by this much. And how much is this much? The answer is by 2. You shift the aggregate demand curve to the right by 2. Now, if you want to shift aggregate demand curve to the right by 2, do you have to increase the government spending by 2? The answer is no. Why? Because of the multiplier effect. Now, let's go back to chapter 11. Remember this graph? If you want to shift aggregate demand curve from A to B, equilibrium income will have to increase by this much. But does that mean you have to increase the autonomous expenditure by this much? No. You only have to increase autonomous expenditure by this much, and then go through the multiplier effect, equilibrium income, equilibrium expenditure will increase more than the increase in autonomous expenditure. Therefore, if we want to increase aggregate demand curve by 2, how much government spending we have to increase? If we increase government spending by this much and then multiply by the multiplier, we can increase aggregate expenditure, aggregate demand curve by 2. So we need the multiplier. What is the multiplier? Government expenditure multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the slope of aggregate expenditure function. So how much is the multiplier? The slope of aggregate expenditure function is 0.5. So 1 over 1 minus 0.5, which is 2. So the multiplier is 2. Then what multiplied by 2 is equal to 2? The answer is 1. Let me go over it again. If the slope of aggregate expenditure function is 0.5, then the multiplier government expenditure multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 0.5, which is 2. So multiplier is 2. Multiplier is equal to 2. Therefore, if the government expenditure multiplier is equal to 2, if government expenditure increases by $1, then equilibrium expenditure income increases by $1 times multiplier 2, which is $2. So you increase government expenditure by 1, equilibrium income, equilibrium expenditure increases by 2. Therefore, you shift aggregate demand curve to the right by 2. That's exactly this question is asking. You want to shift AD0 to AD1. Therefore, you have to shift aggregate demand curve by 2, from 14 to 16 or from 15 to 17. You want to increase you want to increase aggregate demand by 2, then you only have to increase government expenditure by 1 because the multiplier effect, the multiplier is 2. Increasing government expenditure by 1 will shift aggregate demand curve to the right by 2. Now let's look at another example. The second question says, the economy is at point A, exactly the same. Suppose that the slope of aggregate expenditure function is 0.5, same thing. Therefore, the multiplier government expenditure multiplier is 2. But this question says, in order to shift AD0 to AD1, that is going from here to here, that is you want to shift aggregate demand curve to the right by 2. The government wants to use taxes. So the question says, the government wants to cut tax by this much. The result, they want aggregate demand curve to shift to the right by 2. So now you need the multiplier. But what multiplier? Because now the policy action is cutting tax. Therefore, you have to multiply it by tax multiplier. So here, we cannot use government expenditure multiplier. And remember, what is the tax multiplier? When there is no imports and no proportional tax, the answer is negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. Now, if there's no imports, then the slope of the aggregate expenditure function is exactly the slope of the consumption function, which is MPC. Therefore, tax multiplier is negative MPC is 0.5 divided by 1 minus MPC 0.5, which is negative 1. Remember, tax multiplier is always negative. Therefore, if you want to increase aggregate demand by 2, you have to cut tax by 2, because the multiplier is negative 1, cut is negative, right? Therefore, the government can cut tax by $2 because the tax multiplier is negative 1. Now, let's look at another example. The setups are exactly the same. But now the government wants to use a balanced budget operation. What is a balanced budget operation? That is, increases tax by this amount, at the same time increases government spending by exactly the same amount. And I want to shift aggregate demand curve to the right by 2. So what goes in between? The answer is multiplier effect. Which multiplier? You conduct a balanced budget. Therefore, you have to use the balanced budget multiplier. What is the balanced budget multiplier? Remember? That's exactly equal to 1, right? No matter what slope it is always equal to 1. Therefore, if the government increased tax by $1 and government spending by $1, exactly the same amount, aggregate demand curve will increases by $1. Now you want to increase aggregate demand curve by $2. Shift it from shift AD0 to AD1. Then you have to cut the tax by $2 and increase government spending by the same amount to conduct a balanced budget operation. You will be able to shift aggregate demand curve by 2. Therefore, this action is government spending increases by 2 and tax increases by $2. Now let's put everything that you have learned in this class together. Look at this example. In this figure, the economy is initially right here. Same thing. Suppose that the slope of the aggregate expenditure function is 0.75. Now I change the number. And there is no import or proportional tax. Same thing. But now it says to increase real GDP by $2 trillion. The government can increase government spending by how much? Now, I want to bring back the example that we used in chapter 3 at the beginning of the semester. Remember in this question that we went over in chapter 3? This question says, in order to increase the equilibrium, let's use this one. In order to increase the equilibrium quantity by 1, current demand curve is D2. So current equilibrium is here, A, which gives us the current equilibrium quantity is 3. It says to increase the equilibrium quantity by 1. So you want to increase the equilibrium quantity by 1, which is 4. This is Q3. So you want to increase the equilibrium quantity from 3 to 4. That is, you want to change the equilibrium point from A to C. That is, you want to shift the demand curve from D2 to D3. Then how much do you have to increase the demand? The answer was Q4 is 5. You have to increase the demand by 2 in order to increase the equilibrium quantity by 1. Remember this question? So considering the supply curve, when you increase the demand by 2, the equilibrium quantity will increase by 1. That is, when demand curve shifts to the right by 2, the new equilibrium quantity will be 1 more. So let's go back to chapter 13. Original equilibrium is here. So original real GDP is 16. Now I want to increase real GDP by $2 trillion. That is, I want the new equilibrium to be 18. Now, how can I do it? Equilibrium goes from here to here. That is, I want to shift aggregate demand curve from AD0 to AD2 so that my equilibrium will go from A to this new point. Then how much should I shift aggregate demand curve? The answer is from AD0 to AD2, I have to shift this much, this much, this much, this much. How much is this much? From here to here, that will be from 14 to 18. That is, in order to increase real GDP by 2, equilibrium real GDP, I have to shift aggregate demand curve by 4. Now, in order to shift aggregate demand curve by 4, how much government spending I should increase? By 4? No. Don't forget the multiplier effect. Then what is the government spending multiplier? The answer is 1 over 1 minus the slope of aggregate expenditure function. What is the slope of aggregate expenditure function? The answer is 0.75. So 1 over 1 minus 0.75, which is equal to 4. So the multiplier is 4. Therefore, in order to shift aggregate demand curve by 4, all I have to do is to increase government spending by 1. Let me say it again. From here to here. If I increase government spending by 1, because the multiplier is 4, I will be able to increase equilibrium income, equilibrium expenditure, that is, shift aggregate demand curve by $1 multiplied by 4, $4. If I shift aggregate demand curve to the right by $4, that is, I shift AD0 to AD2. Then with this Short-run aggregate supply curve, the equilibrium goes from this point to this point. That is, equilibrium income goes from 16 to 18.